Welcome to the BrettJohnson.biz podcast, where we discuss business on purpose, radically fresh leadership, capital that transforms society, and marketplace stories that embolden difference makers. Welcome to the Repurposing Business podcast. I'm here today with Wes Lyons. Wes, it's an honor to have you with us.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Great. So, Wes, what we're going to do is learn a bit about your story and your background. So, firstly, tell us, where are you, and tell us a bit about Eagle.
So I'm here today in Dallas, Texas, and Eagle Venture Funds, 7.5 years old. A group of us got hired in 2015 to build a private equity fund. We all loved Jesus and loved working together, but 2015 was pretty early in the language of redemptive investing and faith-driven investing, and we weren't given a mandate by our investors to go make an impact. But we loved the venture investing that we did together, and 7 of the 10 ventures that we ended up doing were faith-driven founders. Some of them deeply impactful, including Liveful, who I know is part of this community. And these entrepreneurs like Liveful and others that were growing really fast because of their impact, not in spite of it, really challenged our thinking. Really, in 15 and 16, we're going, wait a second, everyone says to get high impact, you have to push down on the returns. But we kept meeting companies it was really their impact was their core value proposition. Like, them growing was deeply tied with their impact, and kind of founded Eagle around that vision. And now 39 investments later, we still get to do this amazing job of impact investing for Target under this brand. So
that's fantastic, Wes. That's amazing. It reminds me, many years ago, when we started the Institute in 1996, we were talking about purpose being a driver of impact. And back then that was foreign. It was product, price, service. That was it. But purpose wasn't a big deal. But that's come into the mainstream. And it's not a concessionary thing. I mean, a purpose can be a differentiator, and impact can be a driver of profits, the desire for having the right kind of impact. So tell me, Wes, 39 companies is pretty impressive. That's a lot. And so there's a few things I'd like to explore there. Maybe you can tell us 1 or 2 of your favorites as a starter. And then I got a couple of follow-up questions, so you know where I'm going to go with this.
Okay. One that I love to share about is a company called VeraSkills, and they train refugees, we like to say, from kind of being a grocery bagger to a Google coder. It's a AI-enabled ability to teach people to become either AI-enabled coders or AI-enabled service providers. And they've gone from kind of just concept when we met them. And we got to, I think part of the reason it's close to my heart is we got to be part of really shaping what they were, because they came to us with the value proposition saying they could be Code Academy with live tutors. Code Academy is kind of the biggest online how to learn to code platform. And they said, hey, the Code Academy is amazing. Millions of people get trained. But if you get stuck and can't find where the comma is missing on your code, there's no tutor in the loop that can help you kind of break through to the next level. So they said it'd be deeply impactful to have a Code Academy with live tutors. And we were able to help them design the business model, because there's so much demand for this type of talent. Literally millions of positions open in any given year, and say, well, wait a second, we've got vulnerable populations that would love to get upskilled. We've got businesses that are desperate for talent. Is it possible to change the business model from, hey, Mr. Refugee, would you like to pay $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 to go change your life, knowing you don't have it? To, can we get the business to pay? And they ran with that idea. And it ended up being a lot of partnerships with nonprofits that had the relationships with the refugees that made it possible. But today they make millions in revenue. They're on track. I think they're a couple million now, on track to 5 or 6x that, but in the next year,
Yeah.
with 70,000 positions signed up saying, hey, we want to hire a refugee, about 800 folks in training right now, moving towards the thousands. And it's so fun to, anytime we look at social problems and we hunt for this idea of who in the value chain has both the pain and the ability to pay. And in this case, it's the company that has a pain point. We desperately need talent, and they're used to paying for talent, if that makes sense. And when we're able to harness that to really look at all the refugees that have legally come to the country as a talent pool, rather than what do we do with all these refugees? This is a social problem. Let's legislate some help for them. It just creates the chance for exponential flourishing for a community that's vulnerable and just down the street.
Mm. So, Wes, would you say that part of Eagle Venture Fund's value add is helping aspirational leaders attach a cash register to their aspirations? Because it sounds like that's what you did a bit with this business, in the sense that you said, okay, guys, if you looked at this a bit differently, it could actually be viable. It could be more profitable, easier to sell, and so on. Is that something you commonly do?
We do. We about a third of the time we undergo or walk through a business model shift between meeting an entrepreneur and putting our first check in. And sometimes it is that our mental models of how do you find who in the value chain has the pain and ability to pay that are really the breakthrough element. But we also meet amazing entrepreneurs that kind of just have everything put together, and really they just need capital. We tried to build a whole platform where we can match their needs and really accelerate the investment and the impact.
Great. So you're using capital to disciple people.
Yes, I guess you could say that.
Well, you are
I
in
will
this.
say, I think it's interesting. People look where we think of venture capital as the sharks of venture capital. We kind of talk a lot in the media about how negative it is.
Yeah.
But there's also some redemptive elements in that, like we work a ton in combating human trafficking. We have a fund dedicated to combating human trafficking. Capital is a magnet. Like for better or for worse, it pulls people towards you. And I think we under talk about the connective tissue that a venture capital fund can have on a movement. Because to some extent, most of my day is spent either talking to entrepreneurs or investors who care about the either poverty, human trafficking, or health innovation. A lot of human trafficking lately. That produces an immense amount of connective tissue. And there's the influence of the potential of a check writing allows me to make connections that there's kind of some pressure to take my intro. For better or for worse, I just have to acknowledge that when I say, hey, entrepreneur one, talk to entrepreneur two, if that makes sense. When we're trying to pull everybody into a movement, it is really powerful to pair collective action with a venture capital fund. Like Praxis has done a great job of trying to pair collective action with an accelerator, and the Illuminations Project did a really great job of pairing collective action with a giving fund. And they cut what was it, 130 years from 150 years to translating the Bible down to 12 or something, all from collective action. So our experiment is, what if you put collective action with a venture capital fund using the magnet of it? And so there's just a lot to explore about the redemptive side of venture capital, where we mostly talk about its negatives.
Yeah, that's really, really good. I think this is really important when you're tackling big issues, because I've seldom seen individual small businesses that can take down a giant on their own. Mm-hmm. And often, but if you can get them to collaborate, we saw this many years ago when we were working in Cape Town, working with guys in the media business, and actually we were going through a repurposing business consultation. Normally, people can figure out their purpose fairly quickly. We sat for a week, and none of the media companies could figure out their purpose. And part of it was because they were bit players in, somebody did post-production, somebody did this creative directing, somebody else did this piece over here. So we put them into a group, and boom, they figured out the purpose in a heartbeat. And so so I like that, because as a VC, you get to see, for example, another situation we came across in another country was a handful of companies that thought they had the answer to the energy issue. One was a wind company, one was a wave energy, other was lithium-ion batteries, another one was something, actually on their own, none of them could support an electrical grid.
Mm-hmm.
They just couldn't do it. But if they were in a collaborative, so I love the idea that what you call the connective tissue. I really like that. And so that's good. I would say
It's a ton of fun.
yeah,
I
yeah,
think it's also we tend to find when we go do things for the right reasons, like the movement around purpose and business, that on the backside of that, you often see companies performing very well. We've
yeah.
also found on the backside of venture capital, if you build the connective tissue of a collective action movement working on an issue, it drives amazing deal flow. And deal flow is the lifeblood of doing venture capital very, very well. So we shouldn't be shocked that, again, we find out, go build something for the purpose of serving the most vulnerable on the backside of it. It fuels doing business really well. And that's the lifeblood of venture.
Is your VC business more relational than transactional? What I am getting to is let's just say you have the normal stats and 7 out of 10 fail or something like that. But if you've built them into an ecosystem, do they fall into somebody else's net? In other words, company number 3 might fail, but they're complemented by company number 7 and company number 10, and they have a softer landing. Have you found that to be the case?
We do have one going on. I think it's more true when you have a true ecosystem, like is
Yeah.
building around combating human trafficking. Because one startup that's in the process of failing, that came from another venture fund, brought them to us because they were failing and they were touching human trafficking. And we've been able to. We're in the process of trying to pair them, and it looks like it will probably work.
Yeah.
There's some health issues with the founder, but not sure. But that's only true because we have an ecosystem of folks that are really working on this same issue. So anecdotally, that one of one, there's also some that really need to, that it's actually, we look at the sharks of venture capital and say, oh, I can't believe they'll just let things die, if that makes sense. But as
Yeah.
a venture capital investor, it's incredibly tempting to keep feeding money to something for the wrong heart reason, if that makes sense, because you're not willing to, and I think we talked about this briefly at CEF. We don't want to be wrong. Like, we led the deal. We believe that this concept could be true, and often it's so tempting to say, no, I'm not wrong. If we just do one more round of funding, maybe it'll work. When the data is really telling you the market's not ready for this, this is not a great solution to this problem, and you need to face the facts. Hey, Wes, you were wrong. Like, they can't pull this off. They don't have product market fit. Own it. And so there's also a deeply it takes a lot of a spiritual maturity to be able to quickly face when you're wrong,
Right.
and to help, because that entrepreneur can waste you. It's the same as it can be loving to fire somebody, basically. If you let that person drag out for years when you knew really 2.5 years ago they were never going to thrive in this position, it's not actually deeply loving. Exactly same. Deeply painful to walk out the process, but not loving to just ignore pain, if that makes sense.
No, it totally does. Yeah. I was just chatting with somebody in another country earlier this morning, and we were talking about a cultural shift that happened in their company over time. And part of the driver of that is that this was an inherited business, if you like, so a second generation business. But they had to clear out some of the past people, the historical people, before they could and a new culture could flourish. And it's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to go back and say some of the people that were with you in Egypt or with you in the desert are just not going to make it to the promised land. And
that's hard.
it is a hard one. It's a hard one because, altruistically, we think, well, everybody should go to the promised land. But, years ago, my brother said to me, Brett, your problem is that you teach people promised land principles, but many of them want to still live in Egypt. And you can't live promised land principles living in Egypt. You got to get this. And it's quite a hard one to know
Yeah.
because capital is helping to take people on a journey.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just funding a business, it's growing people, growing leaders. And at some point, leaders can decide they have free will. They're not going to grow anymore, or they're going to grow better in somebody else's pot. Like the other VC brought you somebody because they thought they'd flourish better in your pot than in their pot. And It's a hard one to own. Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. I'm reminded when I was about 24 years old, I started pastoring a church. And if somebody left, I was like, oh, that's terrible. After a
Mhm.
while, I'm like, we need a big front door, but an open back door because
Yes.
some people are just going to
Something's
pass.
right.
Yeah, some people are going to just pass through. They'll make a contribution. They'll write their name on the walls. They'll kick a few chairs around and so on and cause a bit of havoc, but they make a deposit and they go. You can't
Yeah,
try to keep everybody just because it's a quote unquote kingdom business or a business with some sort of noble purpose. Yeah, hard one.
it's true. And there's sometimes it takes a moment to unpack. It's hard to even identify in myself, but there's a deep difference between, like in the garden, there was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and there's the tree of life. It's really tempting to just try to be good in impact investing.
Yeah,
Um, and it takes a deep discernment to see like what is like God doing in front of us that is just full of life, and
yeah,
what's people trying to be good, because they can look really similar. And it's
mm,
even hard to understand my own heart when I'm trying to be good versus where I'm actually following, oh, I see the Lord doing something extraordinary. That is a if you figure that out, let me know.
well, I'm going to add a complication in this. Is it good or is it God? Another one that I was just thinking about before we hop on the call, or is it greed? Because
Yes.
because sometimes the greed stuff gets dressed up as good or as God. It's like, I'm doing this because this is what God wants, or I'm doing this because it's for the good of the people. But underlying it, it's actually because, well, the business has started making money. I want a bigger shareholding or whatever.
Hmm.
And I want to change the terms of the deal, et cetera, et cetera. And so now you've got three things you got to figure out: the good, the God, and the greed. There's probably another one that's out there. but
Three,
but
I like threes. I've been wrestling with that. We may not be using the term greed often enough in our conversations about money, because
yeah,
I was at a conference recently where I shared around a table. It was a conversation about economic solutions to economic problems,
yeah,
and I shared about this concept that the purpose of business is not to make money; it's to
right,
solve problems.
yeah,
Um, and I um, and I really offended somebody. Like
yeah,
they were visibly shaken
yeah,
by this idea. Like,
yeah,
no, that like that's not Wall Street won't accept that. That's
right,
not. You could just see how shaken they were, and I was wrestling with it afterwards. Like because when you offend somebody, you kind of have to process like, oh, was I wrong? What's going on? And I probably was wrong in like how I did said it or something like that. But I felt like the Lord was pressing me to go deeper, if that makes sense,
yeah,
and pressing me to think about the concept of greed,
yeah,
in that we've codified on Wall Street that the purpose of business is to maximize shareholder value, or you could restate that as the purpose of business is greed,
yeah,
and to actually stand up and really fight head to head, like Andy Crouch talks about,
mm,
like you cannot serve two masters, like
right,
Mammon, this demon,
mm.
and God. So maybe we're not talking about that word greed often enough.
Yeah, I think you're right. Even the word mammon means greed deified. So you make a god out of greed. And not only do we ignore it, but we say it's something to be aspired to, it's something good. And I would say, even, I presume you have to deal with this when people come to you and they want money to go into something. How do you get to their heart motivation? Because everybody wants to save the world, they want to change the world, but they can't change their socks. We know that. But at the same time, there is this, as we're made in the image of God. We do want to make the
Yeah.
world a better place. That is good. That's great.
Mhm.
Um, how do you get to the question of motive? Do you have some sort of, is it I'm sure that most of the people that you deal with think, oh, if Wes and his team could only make a quicker decision, about whether they're going to
Mhm.
invest in us. But actually, I presume you're going through some sort of filtering process there, right?
We are. It's actually, I mean, we're continually iterating that because we're we're vetting through, sorting through 5 or 6 thousand deals a year now,
Mm,
and it takes a lot of vetting that down. And we just reworked the process to try to get better feedback earlier, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because we say no, like literally, it's a 1/4% of the deals that we
Yeah.
see are we going to say yes to.
Yeah.
And we had a deal recently where we were kind of a year into relationship, probably 10 interactions, and we found a lack of values alignment with the founder. And we had to just own like we missed it. We should have found that lack of values alignment way, way earlier because that's painful.
Yeah.
She had invested a lot of time with us, and we had to say no at a time when you're like, oh, this is not cool to say no at the final hour.
Wow.
If that
Yeah.
makes so we're working on it, but we don't have it solved.
So out of all of the deals that you've looked at, how many have you left at the altar like that?
There's kind of a couple three come to mind over 7 years that where you just like really feel like, oh, I wish that we had seen that earlier because um, it just hurts to go that deep and then say no. So
Yeah, it's hard. That's hard.
yeah.
Wes, let's talk briefly about the other end of it, and then I'm going to change gears a bit to talking about cities. But let's talk about exit strategies, right? Because you've got 39 deals, but you're a relatively new fund. It's not like you've been out there for 30
Yeah.
years. Like it. So are you getting those coming to what you would call the exit stage? And my question is this: I find that, part of what I propose is you have to integrate your career and your calling, your community, and your co-creating with God. So you've got to have convergence of these four areas. And the more you have convergence, the more margin you have, the more fulfilled you are, the more you're in the zone, and so on. And
Hmm.
yet, term sheets historically have an exit strategy. They have an exit clause, and it's either you sell or you IPO, you close the business. And what the struggle there is, if you want people to integrate their career and their calling, you don't exit from a calling.
Hmm.
So how have you dealt with that?
There's there's a couple different types of companies.
Mm.
Some are like we have one company that's a virtual reality company, and they teach people English in virtual reality. Super effective, and love the founder. And his life plan clearly has been to exit from he, and it's kind of a designed for. There's a couple major acquirers, and that's been his plan from day one. If that makes sense, is to build it up to a moment, and he already kind of his plan through that. Those are really obvious. Like that just fits the mold, if that makes sense. And we do even that's a deeply redemptive company. Like they teach
Yeah,
languages 2 to 6 times faster. Like there's a lot of deep redemption in what they do.
yeah,
So those are easy because they fit the mold, right?
right,
It's the ones where people have a lifetime calling and it's probably a 30 to 100-year vision. How do you deal with those? Um,
yeah,
that's where like just we run Eagle University for our entrepreneurs. We just did one this morning on buying and selling companies.
yeah,
And Wade, my partner, has bought or sold 100 companies. And so he's teaching the entrepreneurs what the process is of buying and selling companies. And in many, most VC firms haven't been serial entrepreneurs like our team has to understand how if you have profit, there's actually like 11 different ways to exit. Like we
yeah,
can do share buybacks, we can lever up a little, you basically get money from the bank to
yeah,
be able to buy shares back. We were just talking with friends about listing on the Canadian stock exchange is much easier than listing on the US stock exchange. I'm regularly getting just had an email I read from somebody asking who can buy shares in like they're just third party share buying is getting more and more common. Um, so there's the hard part. I was just kind of preach. The hard part is building something that's profitable and valuable.
yeah,
There's actually a laundry list of ways to create liquidity if you want to stay in leadership, if that makes sense.
yeah.
But that's only true if you have a team that wants to be in this for decades. Um, so it to some degree, just being really good at finance
Mm.
gives you a laundry list of options if you want to stay in the game.
Mm. Yeah. It's a bit of a random question, but I've not seen too much of this. But the notion of getting a share of revenues instead of getting equity, I'm just thinking if I was the chairman of Eagle Venture Fund, and you're on the treadmill, you're on the hamster wheel, get deal flow, sift through thousands of deals, get some, nurture them. I mean, it's a pretty exhausting, intensive experience for you. And then I'm thinking, 5 years down the road, you've done 200 companies. Wouldn't it be great if you were getting 1% of the revenues of 200 companies or something like that? Have you looked at any of those sort of models versus the criticism of VCs that, oh, you take a 30-40% stake, but how much value are you adding and so on?
The we have studied them. Candidly, I have not caught the vision for how that deeply like changes the dynamics, if that makes sense. Because I
Mm,
kind of cringe that most great companies, like you look at Apple, we're always looking at the 5-year projections for entrepreneurs, and they tend to think they'll be running at 60% profit margin in year 5 because they don't know how expensive it is to go
mm,
to 100 million in revenue, which is what they
yeah,
projected, right?
yeah,
And no, almost nobody goes to 100 million in revenue and has 60 million at the bottom line.
yeah,
It just does not happen. They don't understand how hard it is, and that
yeah,
they'd be doing awesome at 12%. Like the average would be between like 5 and 15% when they got there of profit. So I cringe at how little, like if they have a scalable business model, if they end up selling off 5% of their revenue to different investors, and then typically they would only have 10% total of margin. They just gave away half the profit of the company.
yeah,
And so you really got to design for like where are you going, and does this actually deeply align you with your investors, or does it kind of break the model a little bit? um, so I've yet to catch vision how revenue share is actually as honoring as people think it is, if that makes sense.
yeah,
um,
very interesting.
what's deeply honoring is really, really understanding the value of a company at any given time so that you can buy it at the right share price, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Have you ever seen anybody say, okay, well, let's get the investors and the inventors or the entrepreneurs to agree on what they would each be happy with, and the balance is going to go into a kingdom fund? Have you ever seen that?
I have seen people explore those, and I'm interested in it. In general, I think I want to be a student of those models. In
Yeah.
general, we tend to preach against what we call bolt-on impact,
Mm,
which is taking non-unique business models and bolting philanthropy onto it. Because most people are doing that because they think for-profit is evil and non-profit is good, and so they think Tom's would be the poster child of bolt-on impact.
yeah.
They said buy a shoe, give a shoe, and there's at its core, I think it's built on this belief that business is bad, philanthropy is good, wrap some philanthropy on top, and you've redeemed business. And I go, no, that is not. And that's how you end up with an inverse relationship between your bottom line and your impact, because the higher quality of the shoe that Tom's gives away reduces their bottom line.
Yeah.
And we juxtapose that against native impact companies of like, well, let's go build companies that are deeply intertwined. Their revenue is directly tied to their impact, and just build beautiful companies. And then run all those entrepreneurs through journeys of generosity and things like that so that they give away a ton. Um, but I have the sense that there's more to learn. So I feel humble about like throwing out that vision. I just preach hard, hard, hard that that bolt-on impact isn't, people need to split the world and understand the idea of native impact.
Mm,
And then if they still want to go build something with philanthropy into it, sure. But most people don't understand the assumptions they've made to get there.
mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, we are adept at relocating dichotomy. I mean, we think, oh yeah, there's no secular sacred dichotomy, but it pops up again and again. If it's there in the root, you'll see it in the fruit in some way, shape, or form. So whatever you do has to be integrated, not dichotomized.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Great. Okay, let's change gear, and I want to talk about another part in the life of Wes Lyons and the Eagle Venture Fund, and that is city transformation and changing cities. And what I wanted to know is, I understand, Wes, do you want to tell us a little bit what you're doing there? And I want to know where the driver came from that. What was the passion behind that got you saying, look, we live, many of us, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. What are we doing to make a difference where we live? How can we do that given our skill sets? Unpack that a bit for us.
We did two side by side. One is a place-based redemption fund, the Eagle City Fund Dallas, and the other is a cause-based fund of Eagle Freedom Funds, to kind of test. It seems if you internalize the assumption that every business and nonprofit are built for the same reason, to solve a problem, and that the fruit of solving problems is there's a series of them. One of solving one fruit is profit. Then you start to visualize, like, our mental models of the world basically domino into, well, if you're building businesses to solve problems, why wouldn't that go one up and say, let's build portfolios to solve problems? And if the core reason we're building portfolios is to see people flourish and to solve big problems, let's try. If that makes sense. So we tried one place-based fund around seeing the most vulnerable of Dallas-Fort Worth flourish, and then one cause-based fund around combating human trafficking. And candidly, this may be the first time it's sharing publicly, we're having to wrap the City Fund into the Freedom Fund, because there just wasn't, we had one amazing family and a couple, an institution and a couple investors, but about 1.5 million is what we were able to raise. The economics don't work until closer to 10 million. For anybody. It's just the audits and tax and things they just don't work at that size. So we're having to kind of pause that vision because the market just was not ready for seeing a city restored through investments. That language is kind of too far ahead of its time. Maybe we'll bring it back in a couple of years. It was surprising because there's a lot of faith-driven billionaires in the city, and there's well over $1 billion in foundations dedicated to the flourishing of our city. And we would have thought it would have matched those perfectly. But it's just ahead of its time. Notably, cause-based has caught fire, at least in how much, like, Tim Tebow became a partner. We've had one of the world's most famous venture capitalists have come in. It's really that vision of redeeming and seeing human trafficking actually solved has really caught fire. And so, and I've heard other people anecdotally say that place-based is really, really hard to get people to understand, and cause-based tends to be much easier. So we have to, as we try things that we've never seen done before, we have to also be willing to fail. So.
That's very, very interesting because, many, many years ago, like around about the late 1990s in Silicon Valley, what we heard was the problem with Christians is that they come in with problems that are too small. They want $25,000 for this, $100,000 for that, and so forth. But if they really came with a big thing, then people would get behind it. But it sounds like when it comes to a place-based thing, it's been hard work, right?
I mean, honestly, on both. They both are very hard to get people to actually close into. It's really easy to get people to kind of invite you to speak about these ideas because they're so academically stimulating and really interesting stories. But it's so, and you've got to empathize with them. You don't hear a new idea and tend to want to invest on the first conversation. Like, this isn't people, this is not throwing stones at the church or throwing stones at people. It's just, that's not how we tend to respond when somebody introduces a new mental model, is to just jump in head over heels and go personally at risk around a new concept. It's just not how markets work, if that makes sense. So.
And I think that's part of the problem is we talk about markets, right? It's how markets work. So our paradigm is, when you get dealing with investors, the paradigm is the market.
Yeah, I cringe even as I say it. You're right.
Yeah. And actually, versus our mandate, what did Jesus tell us to do? What's our mandate? What are we supposed to be doing? How do we get the market to fit the mandate versus how do we fund the mandate out of the markets? And unfortunately, for better or for worse, the reality is we have, some hundreds of years of history of the way the market works, at least, in the last century or so. And it's produced some good stuff. But as you say, there are challenges. I'm interested in your thought on 10 million being almost an entry level, excuse me, ticket for critical mass for dealing with the transformation of a neighborhood or a city or a
Mhm.
part of a city. And I think that the challenge with that, I would imagine, is it's like, Wes, we'll put in a 500,000 or something, but show us an example of where it's been done. And the problem is you can't do it for 500,000 or 1.5 million
Yeah.
because you're fostering an ecosystem. I'm busy involved. Was just in a conversation this week about designing a new city, and you've got to say to yourself, well, okay, how many businesses do we need? How many coffee shops? How many restaurants?
Mhm.
How many apartments? How many
Yeah.
this before it's actually a place where anybody wants to live? you
Yeah.
know and it's almost like that, like how many interdependent, because you're funding a network, you're not funding a business.
It's true. But also that's kind of highlighting what's really hard about it. What's also really exciting, especially in the cosmic sector, is when you start to have liftoff on a collective action movement
Yeah,
and things just start flying. And
yeah,
that's what we've started to see around human trafficking
yeah,
is there is a dark problem. Like if you
yeah,
start getting into the stories, you just grieve your way through what's happening. And
yeah,
then you find out it's just down the street and you look like I could show you the pictures of our city, 514 brothels active on average, turning over 1 million with 20 women each. Like there's 500 million getting turned over and selling people in our city. And just, it's not hard to extrapolate deep, deep, deep pain for many of those people. And so most of the people in the fight have seen it getting worse and worse and worse over their lifetime and are deeply either just like kind of calloused over because like how do you deal with failure again and again and again at that scale and care deeply about an issue? Um, and I've just had conversation after conversation as people start to hope again when they start to see a movement of people truly solving the issues at scale. So in some ways, deeply, deeply difficult. But if you're able to get a group of people who start to unify around solving a singular issue, it's breathtaking to see the liftoff that can happen, if that makes sense. As and seeing people hope again, seeing
yeah.
people work together again, is really cool. So big problems have their downsides and their upsides. So
So tell me, Wes, the movie Sound of Freedom came out 4th of July last
Mhm.
year. Did that add much to the movement? Did that raise awareness of I know there was a lot of resistance to it in Hollywood and so on, traditional studios, and finally it got out there. It did pretty well at the box office. Did that
Mhm.
stir things up, or where did the momentum come from? Somewhere else?
I think that was definitely a contributing factor. It has more people talking about it. Um, it wasn't super well received by the actual combating trafficking community because it positioned it as a like heroes on white horses saving poor little girls, and at its core, that's not like what the fight is. It's
Yeah,
um, but it has built awareness. More and more people don't give you a blank stare when you say human trafficking. What do you mean? You
right.
know, and that's we do need that's part of the overall rising tide. What is much more effective, like that helps public perception, is there've been a couple massive regulatory drops in the last year, Canada and the EU specifically, that put a huge tailwind. And then the courtroom victories are setting precedent where now you have 40 hotel brands in court for human trafficking. The Red Roof Inn, the first, just settled for $28 million. That is an incredible pressure on the hospitality industry to do something. And when you have the combination of pain and ability to pay, then we can start innovating. Let's go. You know?
So that's sounding a little
Yeah.
bit like Wilberforce. Now, people talk about Wilberforce and dealing with the slavery issue and so forth, but he had to get that through, he had to tag it on as a rider onto a trade bill,
Yep.
right? So you found the economic tail on this thing, which eventually started wagging the dog. Sounds like a similar thing.
Very similar. I mean, the collective action movement that we're building is called the Clapham Accelerator, in an homage to Clap. That was the group of friends that William Wilberforce had.
Mhm.
So we're really watching there's some great books around dense networks and this
Mm.
concept that if you have a dense network that pulls from for-profit, nonprofit, and government,
Mm.
that that is what turns the pages of history.
Mm.
And it's really exciting to be in the room when all three are getting pulled from on a singular problem. Because entrepreneurs on their own can't solve issues,
Mm.
and honestly, politicians on their own really struggle to solve issues, and the church and nonprofits on their own really struggle to solve issues. But if you can pull from all three strengths, you start to get some magic.
Mm. I would not probably add a fourth strand over there just because I separate out capital from entrepreneurs, unless it's entrepreneurs with capital. So if you go back to the Clapham community or the Clapham sect, I just watched, you know, I watched a video recently talking about Wilberforce and the guy who wrote Amazing Grace, John, what's his
Yeah,
name?
Newton. Yeah.
John Newton, right? And it's fantastic and it's great. But I said to the guy who made the documentary, look, behind that was Thornton, and Thornton was the finance guy. He was the capital guy.
I wish that they had highlighted that because I think that's
Yeah,
the invisible magnet at the heart of those three. Like why, like we got 70 people to fly into that room. And part of it was fame because people really want to be in the room with Tim Tebow.
yeah,
But part of it's capital as well. And just for better or for worse, capital is a magnet. Like let's use the magnetic property of capital
yeah.
to glorify God, if that makes sense. I
Yes,
think we
yes.
vilify the magnetic property of capital so much.
No,
Just it's a magnet. Like use it to
yeah,
do things, you know?
yeah, yeah. And for those who don't know, just to give a little bit of background, so there's multiple Thornton families. Godfrey Thornton was part of the Bank of England. His cousin John Thornton was friends with John Newton, and they corresponded. And part of what Newton did was sent him new hymns that he'd written, and then Thornton got those pulled together in a book, paid for the first 1,000, and pile them high, sell them cheap. He wanted almost paperback versions. Then he put them in his ships because he was a trader. So it went out there. They made their way to the States. That's when Amazing Grace became famous and so on. But Thornton was also a cousin or an uncle, I think, of Wilberforce, and funded him and encouraged him to stay in politics and so on. So Thornton was the economic glue through generosity, through hospitality, through encouraging the gifts, through seeing others flourish and staying in his business. He started a bank, which ended up being Bank of Scotland and so forth. So, I mean, they did many, many things. But, and I love the story of when Wilberforce came back, apparently, and said that the bill had passed to abolish slavery. Do you know what Thornton's reply was? Did you hear that?
What are we gonna solve next, or something along those
What
lines?
what are we going to abolish next year? That was the,
Nice.
which I love, you know, which is almost
I
like
do too.
the entrepreneurial capital thing is okay, great. So if we can knock human trafficking, then we'll just pick up another one and we'll do another one. So it's creating a model. So
Yeah.
are you starting to think about that, Wes? You and your team at Eagle Venture Fund saying, okay, great, man, if we can nail this, what's our next big problem?
Absolutely. We're scoping the problems that we want to solve, and even starting to talk about Thornton to like because to some degree we get to it's a 99 investor limit on our funds. We're saying, hey, we can corporately we can invite you to be a community that is the Henry Thornton of this modern day movement, which is an interesting way to position the invitation, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes.
But we envision a day in the like we're definitely like considering um definitely health innovation and and people coming out of prison and refugees and a number of different social issues that have enough momentum around them to build funds around. But in 10 years, we envision success to us means that there's actually many firms doing cause-based funds.
Yeah.
Um, and and people assume that at least in a donor advised fund, if not in your IRA or wherever your capital is that you steward, that you would be growing things on mission, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's a powerful idea.
Yeah.
If the copycats start happening around causes, then
Yeah.
we'll know that something was afoot that was much bigger than us.
Yeah. Yeah. Wes, as you've been talking about this, I've been thinking about something I wrote about in 2010 in a book, Repurposing Capital, which you reminded me of as you were talking. And it's about the eras in capital. As I just took it, I looked at from the Garden of Eden till today and said, what are the major chunks of the eras of capital, if you like? And I was reminded that part of what I wrote about there was, starting with man and families. That was the first era from 4000 to 2000 BC. Then nations from 2000 to 1000 BC. Then the first kingdom, 1000 BC. Then Jesus and the early church, 0 to 300 AD roughly. Then a period of abdication where the Christian world abdicated the world of capital from about 300 to 1400 AD. You couldn't get buried in a Christian graveyard if you charged interest, for example. And I mean, the Jews stayed in the game, and during that era, is Islam started, and after that, Islamic finance and so on. And then we get the Reformation from about 1400 to 1700 AD. Then modern capitalism from 1700 to 2000 AD. And what I've been contending that since about 2000, we're in an era of the spiritualization of capital. And when you talk about capital being and that's got four parts. One is materialism, making a god out of greed. That's a spiritualization of capital. That's the deification of capital, which is mammon. Another is Islam, which is the Islamization. And then the other is causism, which is the radicalization of capital. Now, radical, good or bad. But part of what your fund is tapping into is this trend, I would say, or the fact is that we're in a season where capital goes around causes. And capital is a magnet, as you say, and capital always carries an agenda. And some people get offended by that, but it does. I mean, it always does, and it should.
It does. You can't stop it.
Yeah. So I love the fact that at Eagle, you're thinking about how do you have capital leverage the fact that we're in an era of the spiritualization of capital. And it's either going to be greed, or it's going to be some religious ideology, or it's going to be for good or for harm. It can be, there's many radical negative causes. We don't have to name them, but there can be radical positive causes. And so what you're doing at Eagle fits into what I think I would call the major eras of capital.
I never realized how front and dead in the center that fits in the macro narrative of and it is both sides. It's like the causification of capital is happening all around us, that we're right in the heart of that. That's powerful.
Yeah. And the one thing we can't afford to do is abandon the world of capital as Christians, or blame it or vilify it and say venture capital is vulture capital, private equity is just feeding greed, etc. No, it can be what we want it to be as redeemed people. And I want to commend you and encourage you to not give up on your land-based crusade. I think part of the problem, why I asked about Sound of Freedom, is this. If you'd said, yes, a movie made a difference to the combating of human trafficking, then I would say, okay, Wes, it's time to fund a movie to look at the historical examples of cities that were transformed. I think part of it is our lack of imagination that this can actually be done. It's like, wow, Wes, Brett, you're boiling the ocean if you try to do a whole town or a city or a neighborhood or an inner city area, whatever it might be. But the fact is, it's been done in history, and it's happened before, but we've lost sight of some cities that were birthed from scratch around business ecosystems. In fact, a blended business nonprofit ecosystem. There's plenty of examples of that. There are other systems that were just cities that were trashed, that were terrible, until there was a spiritual awakening, a reformation, and economic revival that took place. I mean, it's happened in history with major cities, whether you're talking about the Genevas or the Seoul Koreas or other places. It's happened. And so we need to celebrate those stories where that has happened. So we get a fresh vision. Yeah, we can't go in with 1.5 million. It's going to have to be 10. It's going to have to be 100. It's going to have to be 1 billion if we're taking on a continent. And
Mhm. I mean,
and
you
we
could effectively put 1 billion to work per city. That's not at all weird, you know?
not very hard. Not very hard. Yeah.
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 No, I appreciate the exhortation, and definitely it's one of those things that you're like, okay, this folding in for this moment, how's it going to rebirth? Because that vision to see the places that we love restored, like that can't die just because a few investors weren't excited about the way we presented this, you know? So
Yeah. Yeah. Wes, as Christians, we're experts at taking macro things and giving them a micro application. And this is also true for the cities thing. So we will say, I read my Bible, and the Bible says, I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans to give you a future and a hope. And we say, that's for me, that's for Brett, that's for Wes.
yes.
Well, we know the context, right? The context was spoken to somebody seeking the good of their city, not somebody seeking the good of their bank account or their family or their wife and the 2 kids and the dog. So, yeah, it's good for us to remind ourselves that God is a city God. God is a nation God. I was just this morning when I was praying with Lynn, just remembering Psalm 2, ask of me and I'll give the nations as an inheritance. And years ago, I was in a meeting and they had people come up from different nations just to say something in their native language. And somebody got up from Brazil and they said something, and God said to me, why haven't you asked me for Brazil? I'm like, I didn't know I was supposed to ask for Brazil. And then I read my Bible. Ask of me and I'll give the nations. And so we have to ask bigger. We have to ask for cities. We have to ask for nations. And we have to have the capital that transforms society, not the capital that meets a portfolio need or does a niche thing. And so I want to encourage you for being bold. And I want to pray that the 1.5 million that didn't quite work out would be a seed that then actually does work out, that the next time it's going to be multiples of that, so that you end up with something, be it with yourself or with others, that can make a difference.
I feel like that deeply touches me to challenge. It's actually the second time in 24 hours, the first in the closing to Ruth Ward Heflin's book on glory. And then now it's like 12 hours later, or whatever it is, both challenging to pray for nations. So I received that I feel convicted. Eh, that's that's a real step up in how to pray. But I do feel like the Lord's speaking that. So
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah, good. Good. Well, Lord, that is our prayer. Thank you for Wes. Thank you for the team at Eagle Venture Fund. And thank you for the fact that they've tackled broad things and bold things. And we pray, Lord, that next time round, we know that Wilberforce didn't get the abolition of slavery passed first time round, that it took many, many years and a team of committed people in prayer. And so we pray, Lord, that future funds will rise up around the world to tackle big problems your way, and that will not shrink away from that just because of we don't see with our eyes the natural models or where it's been successful. So we thank you. Thank you for the commandment to pray for the nations, and we call in the capital that will go along with that in Jesus' name. Yeah.
Amen.
Well, Wes, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. It's been a delight chatting with you. If people want to learn more about Eagle Venture Fund, where do they go?
EagleVentureFund.com.
Quite simple. Fantastic.
Yes,
And you don't just have offices in Dallas, you're more spread out, right?
we are. We've got two general partners in Zurich, and then we just opened in Singapore, which is exciting. Carl Thong and Tim Mong, they are leading the efforts.
Fantastic. So great. So you're in 3 continents at the moment and doing work into how many countries with your 39 companies so far? Is that mostly US based or is it spread out?
It's been a majority US based. Probably 80% of our 39 deals have been based in the US. And that's just been deal flow of where the most redemptive things that we've been able to find. But we're kind of learning to allocate into Asia and Europe really effectively. And it's fun to take things that we've solved, like a lot of what Singapore will be doing is bringing some of the best solutions that we've been working on for 4 or 5 years and say, hey, if these changes are made, it could do brilliantly in the Asian context as well. So
I think that's really, really important because we get this. There aren't unicorns in the Bible, believe it or not, and we
really?
get we get this we get this notion that yeah, it has to be something that's never been done before. But replication is one of the ways that God uses it, and He just simply takes something from one country to another. It's there. I'll bless you.
Yeah.
It'll be a blessing to all nations. So if you've got something that works in the US and it'll work in Asia, or something that works in Europe and it'll work in the US, and funding that is really, really crucial. So I'm glad to see that.
We're excited about it. It feels like a lot of life in it.
Good. Excellent. Well, Wes, thank you
Thank you.
so much. Thanks for joining. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you for all you're doing. And I just really appreciate your teaching and the community around you.